So I came across a popular post on Instagram a few days ago which says, if animals could talk to us, many white people wouldn't be vegan. Many white folks are vegan because animals don't have the ability to hold them accountable, the opportunity to practice saviorism without being corrected by the oppressed is at the core of white veganism. Now, to put it mildly, I think this is nonsense. But this post has 2,649 likes at the time of this recording. 2,649 is more than the number of followers than I have on Instagram. Anyway, so that means that this post is culturally significant enough and widely agreed upon enough for me to sort of address it, right? And since my patron voted for this topic, here's the video. There's also the added benefit that this post, it touches on more than one topic that I've been meaning to talk about on this channel. And we'll begin with a view that I'm not so sure about myself, but I think is a view that is at least worth considering. And then we'll move on to my main criticism of this post and my experience about this, okay? Let's begin. So the view that I'm not so sure about myself, right, has to do with the first line of this post. If animals could talk. Now, there is this Indian author known as Arundhati Roy, who wrote this famous line that, quote, "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard," unquote. Many people are of the opinion that this line, written by Arundhati Roy, also applies to non-human animals. That they too, right, that non-human animals too can indeed talk to us. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's nonsense. Non-human animals cannot talk. But allow me to play the devil's advocate for a while. See, I speak 4 languages, right? And English is my 3rd language, right? Let's say I never learned to speak English, which seems possible, and you saw me being harmed somewhere, right? Someone was harming me. And in that time, right, when someone is harming me, I call out for help. And obviously, I will not be doing that in English, right? I will be speaking in the languages that I do speak, or at least in one of the languages that I do speak. Now, most of you watching, in fact, almost all of you who are watching, cannot understand all the other languages that I do speak. The sounds that I will be making to speak any one of those languages, they will make as much sense to you as the sounds that a chicken makes, that a goat makes, and so on, when they are being killed, right? So the question is this: at that point, when I'm speaking a language that you simply do not understand, right, making sounds that you do not understand, that you cannot decode, right, that you cannot comprehend, am I talking to you? Can I talk to you? Now, whatever you think of that, right, whatever your answer to that question is, the view, the opinion, is that the same applies to non-human animals. That although they cannot speak to us in English or in any of the human languages, it doesn't mean that they are not talking to us. The view is that they do talk to us, not in English or in French or in Spanish or in Hindi or in Assamese. They speak to us in the language of being terrified. That is the view. Now, this does not mean that we have to give non-human animals the rights to decide to the dot, to the finest of details, about what is best for them. We do not have to ask non-human animals whether they would prefer being out in the street, in the middle of traffic, or in a sanctuary. We can decide that for them, that being in a sanctuary is what is best for them. But this in itself would not contradict the notion that non-human animals do indeed talk to us, right? This wouldn't contradict the notion that they can indeed express what their basic and overall interests are. Interests like not wanting to be killed, for example. Now, I'm not married to this idea, right? As I said earlier, I was playing the devil's advocate. So I don't firmly hold on to this idea, nor do I completely reject it, right? I've been back and forth on it a few times. I would love to know what you think of this, and reading your comments might help me decide about what the correct opinion is. So after watching the rest of this video as well, do be sure to leave a comment letting me know what your thoughts are about this notion. Oh, by the way, if you're finding this video to be insightful, do be sure to voice your opinion by subscribing to the channel and liking this video.
You see what I did there?
Anyway, let's move on. Now the rest of this tweet says, quote, "Many white folks are vegan because animals don't have the ability to hold them accountable, the opportunity to practice saviorism without being corrected by the oppressed is at the core of white veganism," unquote. Before I move on to my main criticism, I want to quickly point out that this is a misunderstanding of what veganism is. See, this tweet, it equates veganism to vegan advocacy, and they're not the same thing. Everyone who is vegan is not necessarily a vegan advocate or an activist. They just don't contribute to the unnecessary suffering of innocent, sentient, non-human animals. And that's okay. Similar to how everyone who is not a racist is not necessarily an anti-racism activist or advocate. And that's okay. You might be able to make the case that if the oppressed group starts holding the activists and advocates accountable, that those activists and advocates would maybe stop being activists and advocates, or maybe just block out the oppressed group, right, who criticize them and who hold them accountable. But to say that they would start actively harming the very oppressed group that they were just fighting for, I think that's a bit of a stretch, and I think that's incredibly unlikely. And when someone is not vegan, right, they are indeed actively harming an oppressed group, which is non-human animals. Now, before we move on, I would like to quickly add that if we could understand what non-human animals are saying to us about how much they suffer, about how terrified they are in slaughterhouses and in dairy farms and so on, that more people would be vegan, right? Not necessarily vegan advocates and activists maybe, but certainly more people would be vegan. I'm pretty sure about that. And this brings us quite nicely onto the main point of this video, which is, would white people still be vegan advocates and vegan activists if non-human animals could communicate to us in, let's say, English, right? If they could communicate in English how much they suffer, how terrified they are. In my experience, there seems to be a group of advocates and activists who would hypothetically stop being advocates and activists for animal liberation if non-human animals could communicate to us in English. And many of them are white people, but to categorize this group, to label this group as white people, is just factually incorrect. I think the group that would stop being vegan advocates and activists are people who try to make the animal liberation movement about themselves. The people who say, well, human beings are animals too, therefore the animal liberation movement should also focus on human issues. This to me is the moral equivalent of shouting, well, Westerners are human beings too, therefore if someone is trying to make efforts to uplift the conditions of people in post-colonial countries, such as India, that their efforts should also focus on marginalized Westerners. I mean, sure, there are marginalized Westerners who face marginalization up to some extent in Western countries, but relative to people in post-colonial countries, such as India, all Westerners, regardless of race, are hyper-privileged. The average Indian American or the Black American or any kind of American, right, regardless of race, is hyper-privileged relative to people in post-colonial countries, such as India. Western privilege is a real thing, no matter how much some Westerners might like to deny its existence. Now, what happens when someone from a post-colonial country, such as India, points out to such Western vegans who try to make the animal liberation movement about themselves that just as non-human animals deserve a movement dedicated solely to their interests, so do people from post-colonial countries deserve a movement dedicated solely to their interests, and that such efforts need not cater to the needs of Westerners. What happens then? Well, you get blocked, just as I was blocked by several of these plant-based speciesists for explaining the simple truth. And here's the fun part, I was also blocked by this person who made the tweet, right, for explaining this simple truth. Now here's the funny thing, if you did not notice, the moment the oppressed held her accountable, she blocked the oppressed. And that, to me, is exactly what would be done to non-human animals if hypothetically they, like me, could speak English. If hypothetically they, like me, could hold accountable such hyper-privileged Westerners. And if we are going to look from the perspective of the non-human animals, if they could hold accountable such hyper-privileged human beings in general, because relative to non-human animals like pigs and chickens and goats and cows and so on, almost every human being on this planet is hyper-privileged. Now, I was told in a few comments that I should not get a haircut because allegedly my hair looks good. So if you'd like to help me maintain this hair, you can support the channel via Patreon. It's the first link in the description box. You can follow me on social media here. If you would like to know the full story of how I was blocked by such hyper-privileged Westerners for explaining the simple truth that marginalized groups deserve movements dedicated to them, I have actually made a full video about that, which you can watch here. This is the video YouTube thinks you like the best. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what your thoughts are about this video, about all the points I made in this video, and I'll see you there.